Hi, and welcome to Take Every Thought Captive, our weekly look at the Catholic intellectual tradition and an exploration of the authors, books, and topics that have shaped Catholic thinking for 2,000 years. I'm Dr. Richard Bolzakelli, lecturer in theology at Catholic Studies, in for Jason Gale, and I'm joined this week by Dr. Smith, our lecturer in philosophy. Today we'll be taking a bit of an introspective approach. We always say in our introduction to this podcast we concern ourselves with the Catholic intellectual tradition, but just what do we mean by that? We talk about people who aren't Catholic after all.
Right.
And some are even hostile to the Catholic faith. So this is a good question, I think. And today we're going to try to get to the bottom of it. But before we do, let's not forget the basics. Like and subscribe, hit the bell, leave your comments down below, and don't forget to share this content on social media. So, Dr. Smith, do you have any initial thoughts on this topic?
Sure. Rich, one of my favorite classes that I took in undergraduate many years ago was I took a 2-semester course on European intellectual history. Right? Doesn't that sound fun? Like it was like a really cool course,
It's politically incorrect today, but yes.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
Sound fun.
Oddly enough, it was taught by a Marxist, but like the only professor I can say with certainty was a true like doctrinaire Marxist, right? But she was actually great. She was a great teacher, actually, but it was a fascinating class, and it introduced me to the idea of intellectual tradition or intellectual history, right?
Yeah.
And when I think about Catholic Studies Academy, that course and maybe some other things I've read sort of influenced kind of the way I think about it. I think at the beginning, we didn't, when we were putting this together, we didn't sort of talk about the podcast as an introduction to Catholic dogma, right? Or strictly speaking, an introduction to Thomist philosophy or Catholic theology, right? That sort of thing, right? We wanted actually to talk about something that's broader than that, right? And I think something that's really deep and attractive and really wonderful, right? And worthy of praise, which is this broader Catholic intellectual tradition. When people ask me sometimes about, what brought me into the Catholic faith, I can say a variety of things, but certainly one of the resources, one of the factors at play was just, the sense of the wealth and the riches of this Catholic intellectual tradition, right? In which I would include people as different as Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, of course, but then also people like Dante, right? You'd want to include people like John Henry Newman, right? As well, right? And maybe even some Catholic authors, right? Like Evelyn Waugh or people like that. So we're in a literary tradition, right? Which we don't touch on very much because it's just not our area, but we do focus more on theology and philosophy. But that's part of it, I would say, as well. So when I think we're talking about the Catholic intellectual tradition, we're talking about a tradition of thought, a tradition of inquiry that is broader than, say, Catholic dogma, or I would say Catholic tradition in that capital T sense, right? We're not, we're talking about something that's broader than that, right? Does that sound accurate to you, Rich?
Yeah, it does. I have a couple of initial thoughts on that. So,
Sure.
we could name, of course, a lot of Catholic thinkers who do all sorts of things. And one could make the argument that in as much as they're Catholic and, they're not completely, whatever they do isn't really completely disconnected from the faith. These are integrated people. That must be in some way attached to the Catholic tradition. But we can go much further than that even, I think.
Right.
Now, I don't think we want to end up with a term that it's so loosely defined that it doesn't really mean anything.
Sure.
But but I look at when we look at the documents that come out of the Second Vatican Council, right? For example, there was there was in discussions of the Eastern churches. It's interesting here that there was an effort made at that time to kind of come to grips with the fact that these churches, though separated from us, and acknowledging that that separation is not without its difficulties, are nonetheless true churches, that we've always acknowledged that they have apostolic succession, that they have valid sacraments. And so there was a statement. I don't remember which document off the top of my head. This is just occurring to me now, so I didn't like prep for it. But there's a statement, maybe it's in Lumen Gentium, that actually describes them as part of the Catholic tradition. That basically their theological tradition is part of our own, and that's an interesting idea, which I'll come back to in just a second. But I think of the people that we talk about who are obviously outside the Catholic tradition.
Sure.
They don't share any of the same core beliefs that we do, right? They oppose some of them. We talk about Karl Marx, we talk about Hegel.
Sure.
We've probably talked about Schopenhauer, Nietzsche for sure, right? These guys, I mean, are they part of the Catholic tradition? Well, the way I tend to think of it is, what are the issues and ideas with which the church is engaged
right
in any given age, right?
Sure.
And so I think in that respect, right, it's maybe Friedrich Nietzsche as such isn't part of the Catholic intellectual tradition. He opposes it.
Sure.
But our existence as Catholics is shaped by the fact that we have to confront Nietzsche, and that Nietzsche is confronting us.
That's true. Yeah. And over a central question, right?
Right.
Or set of questions, right? And I think maybe that's a good way to think about it is, we did a series on Marx, right? And I think, again, Marx very hostile to religion, very hostile, to Roman Catholicism. But as Catholics, we do have a long interest in the social order and political community, right? And community in general. And Marxism addresses that, you think about the great social encyclical Rerum Novarum, right? There's a kind of almost a direct confrontation, right? Of the church with respect to both capitalism and Marxism, right? That both, right, are sort of at odds with a Catholic answer, right, to the social question. But one really clear point is that this is a question for Catholics, right? That social question is not illegitimate, right? Now, we have other elements within our tradition that don't emphasize the social question, right? And that's fine, right? Not everything does everything, right? You can't be a great, at everything and concentrate on everything. But so you have the T-shirt I have on here where it's Memento Mori, right? Remember death. There you have a little bit more of like the Benedictine flavor, in which you kind of have maybe a little bit of the flight from the world and an emphasis on the otherworldly, right? That's fine. That's a different part of that intellectual tradition. But certainly a part of it is the social question, right? The question about how society should be justly organized. That's something that's distinct, I think, about the Catholic intellectual tradition. Not every Christian tradition is as engaged in that, or at least has been historically, right? And so that is something I think that's a marker, and then does bring us into a wider conversation, right? If you're going to ask the social question, where you're going to have, you don't necessarily have all the conversation partners you want. You have the conversation partners you have, right? Historically, right? At that time, which might be people like Karl Marx and Friedrich Nietzsche, right? And so that's why it's relevant. Now, obviously, that's not, you wouldn't think of Nietzsche or Hegel or Marx as the core, I would think, of the Catholic intellectual tradition, right? But certainly engagement with them is going to be part of that history, right?
Yeah.
And so I think, when you situate the Catholic intellectual tradition historically, right, then it makes a lot of sense that you're going to be pulling in kind of a broad spectrum of things, right? Both in terms of opponents and alternatives, right? As well as sources. So one way maybe of thinking about this is, let's just take the disputed question, right, as a model.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
The disputed question, in that sort of medieval, very formulaic way, brings in alternatives, right? You bring in the objections, right?
Mm-hmm.
The people you disagree with. And of course, especially if it's, a disputed question of theology, you're going to bring in your sources, right? You're going to talk about scripture. You're going to talk about the fathers. You're going to talk about church councils, things of that nature, right? So you're going to have a diversity of sources as well, or if, even if you're working in a philosophical mode, you'll bring in the philosophical tradition or sources that you're relying on, right? But there in that disputed question, right, you see, maybe I'm thinking about, I don't know, the nature of Christ, right? Or something like that, right? But I have to bring in all sorts of things that maybe I disagree with, and also have to bring in sources that maybe don't directly bear on the question, right? But are nevertheless resources for me in trying to answer that question.
Right.
So does that make sense?
Yes, it does. So it's interesting though that we've got there are times in our history, right, in which we've not done the best job of that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
For example, Johann von Eck, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is kind of like in response to the Protestant Reformation. He's got his attitude was non disputandum cum hereticis refutandum, right? We don't dispute with heretics, we refute them.
Mm-hmm.
And that particular attitude, if you want to think about it, right, that particular attitude is in some ways it truncates this sort of engagement approach to Catholic tradition.
Sure.
Right, you see what I mean? And I think that one of the criticisms from people like Ratzinger and the other ressourcement and aggiornamento types during the Second Vatican Council was really that we had become entrenched in a disengagement approach. And so the Catholic intellectual tradition was sort of atrophying.
Sure.
What do you
So
think
you kind of
that?
like you only study Kant. I think the phrase I like that helps here a little bit is you study Kant like anti-aircraft gunners study airplanes, right? Only to shoot them down, right?
Right.
Instead of trying to appreciate or understand Kant. That doesn't leave out, of course, very importantly, engaging in criticism, right? Critique is part of engagement, but it's not the only part of engagement, right? Like if you're going to be engaged with a thinker, I always try when I teach my students, an introduction class, I try to teach them, look, let's understand this first. Let's not start by like trying to shoot every little bit down. Like try to get a picture, try to understand the parts, try to get a sense of the whole, right? Because then, like, especially like say I'm teaching something kind of far out, like an argument for the Platonic forms or something like that. Well, that's going to be, I'll tell them, like, this is going to be weird. It's going to be kind of uncomfortable and odd, but just wait until we've done it for a couple of weeks and you have a sense of the full picture, right? Only then are you actually even beginning to be in a position to be critical, right? That'd be perfectly
Yeah, that
honest.
was an important
I think if you're,
lesson that I
oh,
learned during my undergraduate career,
mhm,
right?
mhm,
I remember I fairly early on when I started studying philosophy, I became attracted to certain thinkers and certain ways, certain sort of metaphysical presuppositions. And I found it difficult to give other philosophical traditions a fair shake,
sure,
right?
right.
Um, and I would just sort of like I'd be like, well, that can't be right because blah 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 blah. And I might be right in that critique, right? That
Sure.
could be correct.
Yeah, it might be
But the
accurate.
problem is I'm not at that point, I'm not seeing why the view appealed to someone in the first place,
Sure, sure.
what problems it identifies, that maybe my system of thought doesn't give a fair treatment to,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe this question is still hanging out there. No one's solved this particular problem, um, and this guy's trying to solve it, right? That's what motivates him.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, I think that's really kind of an important thing.
Yeah,
And so I guess I would say that, and you see this actually, you mentioned the disputed question thing,
sure. Mhm.
right? In the Middle Ages. Remember that the idea there is to give your interlocutor his best argument, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yep. Yeah, I mean that's important. One of the things that I always try to point out to students, I at different times I've had students write a disputed question
Yeah,
as
I've
an
done that too.
exercise.
Yeah.
It's a fun exercise,
Uh-huh.
and it's actually intellectually just for your mind, right? It's a good exercise to try to. This is actually tricky.
Yeah.
Displace your view and try to imagine you're in the other position and come up with the best arguments for the person you're opposing,
Right.
right? That's exactly, I mean, that's a very important step, most of all because it shows your intellectual integrity in terms of I'm really after the truth. And
Yeah.
when I formulate that other person's view, I might actually learn like, hey, actually that's the point, like
Hmm.
I've actually I'm showing them doing the work, right? Of
Yeah.
actually testing, right, my hypotheses, right? So I think
Yeah.
that's important, really important step just for your own mind. And I think this is very important, an important aspect of the Catholic intellectual tradition, right? That
Yeah.
is disputation, uh, with engagement, right? That's important, right? There is that kind of, I guess, a way of embracing critical thinking. Having been now so engaged with the Catholic intellectual tradition for so many years now, I always find it baffling when people just talk about from outside, just sort of have this view that if you're a Catholic, you don't have any critical thinking or whatever. And I was like, really, like you just don't,
You
you
haven't
literally don't
obviously
know
haven't
what you're
read
talking
anything.
about, right? Yeah, right. Like you're just ignorant. Like it's like me. It would be like me saying something like, maybe some people say this guy like there's no philosophical thought in the Islamic tradition, right? Well, you just
Uh-huh.
don't know what you're talking about. That's false, right?
Yeah.
Like
Uh-huh.
if you actually read some stuff, right?
Right.
So if in our conversation here, like a couple of points have come out, right? One is that we want to think about the Catholic intellectual tradition as being critical but engaged, right? So
Yeah.
like engaged in certain questions and engaged with sort of the broader world, I guess you might say, even to our opponents, right? So there's a sense of engagement, but also engagement with certain questions like the social question. Obviously, Christological questions, Trinitarian questions are would also be, even much more central to
Hmm.
this tradition. And also talked about the idea of this tradition as historically situated. And I think that's a good thing to lean into a little bit more here. One thing I would want to say is, kind of think about if we're talking about our interlocutors who are outside the tradition, that's kind of at
Yeah.
the peripheries of the tradition, right? But I think part of the core is that any intellectual tradition is actually emerges and is embodied in a concrete historical community and set of institutions, right? Not that it has to be the same set of institutions over the whole period, right? So, for
Hmm.
example, the Catholic intellectual tradition existed before the medieval university. Certainly, the medieval university put a stamp on the Catholic intellectual tradition that will never go away, right? I think like it'll always be part of the conversation, right? If you're talking about the Catholic intellectual tradition. Obviously, though, look at what we're doing. We're on a podcast,
Yeah.
right? And we're part of a thing called Catholic Studies Academy, right? And that's not a medieval university, you know what I mean? Like institution. So there's new institutions in which this can exist, but you can still say, look, there are historical institutions and a historical community that that makes possible this intellectual tradition, right? And of course, what I want to say is the most obvious thing. It's the church, right? It's the Catholic Church, right? There would be no Catholic intellectual tradition if there were no Catholic Church, right? And so this intellectual tradition, this tradition of thought, right, of reflection most essentially on the Gospels and the message of Christ and the reality of Christ, right? I would say, right, maybe most essentially. But within this community, right? So with all due respect to say, our separated brethren who are in Protestant communities, we might have a conversation with them, right? Because there is some basis for unity, but they're not sort of at that core of the Catholic intellectual tradition because they don't want to be, right? Yeah. They're not part of that community. If that makes sense. I'm not trying to relativize it in a sociological way, but I am saying that is that's an essential element, right? It exists within this community and addresses the concerns of this community.
Right. So, so there's this idea that it's part of the life of the church, right?
That's right. Yes, right. It's not just something that sort of falls out of the sky, right? There's a concrete revelation in Jesus Christ and in the Hebrew scriptures before that, right? That motivates and grounds this community, right?
Yeah. And so here we are collectively from all our different vantage points and within all different states of life, engaging that reality, right? And trying to live it out and in the historical context in which we live.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so, you think about one of the problems, one of the things that I like to bring up from time to time is, do you know what part of the Summa was most broadly copied and circulated in the medieval period? And most people might guess, well, it's going to be, the treatise on God, right?
Yeah. Or so today, it's interesting because I don't know the answer to this question off the top of my head, but But here's what I think. This is what I would have said when I was an undergraduate. I would have assumed it was the prima pars, and particularly the stuff on God, right?
Right, sure.
That's what I would have assumed because that's what. If you take a volume of the Summa Theologiae off a library shelf that's been sitting there for many years, it's clearly the most worn volume on the shelf.
That's right. Yeah. So it's really the Secunda.
Yeah.
Which is the moral stuff that would be used by a confessor. Isn't that cool? And that's because the Dominican preachers, right? Their primary task was preaching and confession. That's like in their early days, that's what they did, right? And so it makes sense, right? See, Thomas is writing theology. Certainly he wants to write theology so that the mind ascends to God and provides you with this kind of contemplative context, which is important. But also like for his fraters, right? Like for the other Dominicans who are going about the work of preaching and hearing confessions. That's a good example, right, of theology and the Catholic intellectual tradition being embedded in the life of the community. Right?
Yeah, it's also it's another interesting part of that, and I don't want to get too distracted like down this rabbit hole, but it is interesting, right, to understand how our perception of our own tradition becomes distorted over time. And we have the impression that the Middle Ages is all about the Sume, right? It's all about the systematic
Right.
stuff. And that's a distorted view. I mean, the reality
Sure.
is that there was plenty of hagiography going on in the Middle Ages.
Of course.
There
Yeah.
was there was scriptural commentary all over the place.
Sure. Yeah.
They were the development of the sermon conferences. It was not like the Sume was in the ivory tower,
Sure. Yeah.
but there
Yeah, it
was
was
so much more going on.
yeah, it was an important part of a broader whole, right? But it was not in any way exclusive, or
Mhm.
even probably predominant, right,
Yeah.
in the lives of most Catholics. I mean, think about the cult of the saints,
Mhm.
and those sort of things is probably being much more to the fore
Mhm.
for the average person. But even say something with the cult of the saints, or say say the emergence of the cult of the Blessed Sacrament, right, in the medieval period, right? You see that emergence, and you see theology kind of growing along with the piety, right, of the
Yeah.
people, in terms of, oh, we really need to sit down. Okay, we've always maybe affirmed that this is really the flesh and blood of Christ, but what does that really mean? Because it doesn't look like flesh and blood, and so
Yeah.
we need to kind of start thinking about like this, as well, right? And also, there's some people who are coming up with bad answers, right?
Mhm.
Interestingly, though, even bad answers are kind of part of the Catholic intellectual tradition too. It's kind of
Yeah.
like you kind of got to get, like, the ball's got to start somewhere, right? And
Well,
so
yeah,
maybe
sure. So let's look at going all the way back to the patristic period, even very, very early on, right?
mm,
You look at people like Tertullian and Novatian,
mhm,
and now those are two guys who are kind of more on the fringes of the Catholic tradition, right? One,
sure.
because Tertullian was this is a very interesting point, right? Tertullian was in a sort of irregular relationship with the church toward the end of his life.
Mhm,
He had become involved in Montanist sympathizing North African moral rigorists,
mhm.
and Novatian was one of the first anti-popes of the church,
Right. Yeah.
um, and he was also a North African moral rigorist.
Mhm,
But both of those guys made tremendous contributions to the Catholic
sure.
intellectual tradition and are very much, important fathers of the church.
Right. Right.
So if you look at, who's one of the most, not the most, but one of the most quoted authorities in the Catholic doctrinal tradition,
Mm,
that would be Tertullian,
yeah.
right? He's
Sure.
one of the most
Sure.
common sources in the Catechism.
Yeah. Mhm,
So, it's very interesting, right, about that. But now, when you look at their work on the Trinity, both of them wrote on the Trinity
mhm.
at a time before the pivotal councils in which the church came away with like this. Okay, we got the formula.
Right.
They're groping at a way of articulating the thing. But if
Mhm,
we look at what they actually said by the standards of orthodoxy established at Ephesus and Chalcedon,
mhm.
um, it wouldn't have it wouldn't have passed muster.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, sure, sure. But that shows you, like, where that development has to take place, right? I mean, um, like, as part of both kind of the dogmatic tradition of the church, more importantly, but even sort of the broader Catholic intellectual tradition that we're talking about, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there is sort of it is interesting, right? Like, there is a way in which you might aspire towards, I want to be careful how to say this, immutability. And
Hmm.
certainly we do think that there are immutable truths that are part of the Catholic dogmatic tradition, right?
Yeah.
Um, but those emerge, it seems to me, kind of from those immutable points, like, in my imagination, kind of, I kind of like, they're like sort of like it's a matrix of, there's a matrix of change and sources and factors kind of flowing together, and out of that matrix there are points, right,
Hmm.
that emerge as sort of immutable points, right? But they're sort of surrounded by a larger sort of network, right, of sources and trains of thought, and historical moments or historical movements
Yeah.
that come and go, and that's not bad. It's part of being human, right? It's part of
Mhm.
history, right? It shows we're actually engaged in what's happening. The so yeah, I think that's a important to recognize, right? That the change is going to be actually part of the Catholic intellectual tradition, right? And actually that's not just okay. That shows that you were actually embedded in reality, right?
Yeah.
Like again, the question of industrial capitalism didn't exist in the 8th century. You couldn't have written Rerum Novarum,
Right. Right. Mhm.
like Rerum Novarum comes in at a
That's why
particular
it's called New
time.
Things, right?
Yeah, that's right. It's new things, right? Yeah. Some of the principles are very old, right? That Leo the 13th draws on,
Mhm.
right? And they come from the past, right? But it is sort of a new question, which that very sort of dynamic there, makes me think of another element that I think is important to bring in here and that is what we mean with the word tradition, right?
Yeah.
Here, I've already said, of course, we're not talking about the dogmatic tradition, although it's related to the dogmatic tradition.
Mhm.
But tradition, right, literally, and it is, the Latin term under here is tradire, right, which means something like to hand on,
Yeah.
right?
Uh-huh.
And that presupposes something to be handed on, right? And in this case, from the past. So even though the Catholic intellectual tradition at its best is engaged in the present, right, and with many interlocutors, it also looks to the past, right? And this is probably what makes the most, very a pronounced aspect, right, of the Catholic intellectual tradition.
Mhm.
And I think rightly so, and very importantly so, right? I think, if I was giving advice, when I have given advice, I should say, to younger scholars, right? I always say you're never going to waste time reading Plato.
Yeah.
Just keep, I mean, you read Plato on and on and on. Am I a Platonist? No. But are you going to waste time reading Plato? No. Why? Because he is his impact is so gigantic within the history of philosophy and within the Catholic intellectual tradition that it's always going to be useful and fruitful for you to have studied him, right?
Yeah.
And I'd say the same thing about certain other what I would call canonical lower C authors or questions, right? Like one of my favorite things is to walk people through kind of the efforts of early Greek philosophy to get to certainty, right?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And the way Plato does that, and the way Aristotle does that, and that it's a great little sort of I don't know, episode, right, in the history of philosophy
Mhm.
to work your mind through, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Or
and so
to account for the relationship between permanence and change, right?
exactly, yes, yeah, very good, right? And so I think the Catholic intellectual tradition is always looking back, right? Like you should always, if you're a Catholic theologian, know the history of the Christological controversies,
Yeah.
right? Your mind should be embedded in in those episodes, right? Such that you can kind of recount them, relive them, rethink them, in a very sort of lively and
And
engaged way.
you have to, because there's the adage that those who don't remember history are condemned to repeat it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's true theologically as well as politically.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's if we don't understand the Christological and Trinitarian controversies of the early church,
Right.
we're really probably going to start reaffirming some of those heresies
Right.
because
And in fact, you see it happening, right?
yeah, you see it happening all over the place.
Right. Mm.
And the reason is that those heresies actually make sense. They may be incorrect ultimately. They might
Right.
not
Yeah.
be able to do what we need a teaching to do
Mm-hmm.
within the framework of orthodoxy,
Right.
but they're easier for the human mind to wrap itself
Sure.
around,
Sure. Yeah.
right? And that's
Yeah.
why they were so appealing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. This is one of my favorite things actually to think through as a Catholic, especially in the light of, and it should be really for any Christian, but in the light of, say, the New Testament witness, right? I mean, you come up with these answers that are answers, right, to the question of who and what is Jesus Christ, right? But that they're just not adequate to the data, right?
Right.
You know, at the end of the day, maybe I have a really hard time offering a better explanation, right? But I know that the data doesn't seem to fit with
Yeah, there's something being
what you're
left out of
saying.
account in
That's right.
this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Hmm.
Right. Which I think again shows you the importance of being a Catholic intellectual. You're seeking understanding, right? You're living within a certain community. You're engaged with contemporary, questions, but you're always engaged with the past, right?
Yeah.
Too, because for a variety of reasons, but one of which is to be a Catholic is to be engaged with those sources, right? To draw from Thomas Aquinas, to draw from Augustine, to know your Plato, to understand the Christological, controversies, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah. And to understand those controversies too, you need to understand the philosophical presuppositions with which
Right.
various
Mm-hmm.
interlocutors were working.
Mm-hmm.
And they
That's
weren't
right.
always the same
Sure.
as one another, right?
Sure.
Which
Yeah. I mean,
complicates the issue.
yeah, a very important thing I always try to remind students when that does come up, right, is that early Christianity, from a metaphysical perspective, right, it's just the broader philosophical world. Platonists and Stoics were the primary
Yeah, that's
interlocutors,
right.
not Aristotelians.
Right.
For a variety of reasons, both Platonism and Stoicism were just much more popular,
Yeah.
and much more prevalent.
And that's
And
true for
that's
like the first 1,000 years or more of
yeah, that's a big part of the tradition, right? Yeah, you need to be aware of that, for
so
sure.
let me that reminds me of something I wanted to respond to from what you said earlier.
Mhm.
Because you were talking about being willing to engage a philosophical view, even if it's wrong,
Mhm.
right? And it occurred to me, well, what would have happened in the history of the church if we had never been willing to do that, right? But we'd have no philosophical framework, right? I mean, Platonism, I'm
Yeah.
sorry, but Platonism, Neoplatonism wasn't good enough
Mhm.
ultimately, right?
Sure.
It has a lot of utility. It has a lot
Mhm.
to offer, but there are built-in problems to
Sure.
Neoplatonism, which led
Yeah.
to innumerable heresies
Heresies, that's
in the church.
right.
Now,
Yeah. Yeah.
by the time the Middle Ages came around, we'd kind of worked through a lot of that,
Sure. Mhm.
right? And became a
Yeah.
system with we were comfortable navigating the landmines.
Yeah. I think it's
Uh,
legitimate to say we had developed a Christian Platonism by that
yeah,
point.
right,
Right.
right. Then Aristotle comes along,
Mhm.
and we have the same problem. And there
Mhm.
were people who were like, no, we're not,
That's right.
right? I mean, we're not going to, this is crazy. Um,
Right.
and they refused to engage.
That's right.
But
Yeah.
eventually
They're
we
right.
developed a sort of, Aristotelian, um, we developed a sort of Christian Aristotelianism.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's fair. I can't remember. I saw that phrase in a book or a conference title or something, and I was like, that's right. That's actually what you need to say. I mean, it's there's a within the broader Catholic intellectual tradition, there's a movement, an intellectual movement, a historical movement of Christian Platonism. There's a
Hmm.
historical movement of, or you might say Platonizing Christians,
Hmm.
and there's a movement of Aristotelian, using Aristotle. I can't turn Aristotle into a verb; it's too hard. But the Christian Aristotelians, right, who are Christians using Aristotle, right, and bending those ideas, to their Christian purposes, right,
Hmm.
and in a way that's in view with the Christian, data, and broader sort of Catholic, tradition. Um, I think it's helpful to think about them in those ways, um, for sure. But so there's an interesting when I think about it. So that I really insist on the importance of looking back, drawing on on the resources. This also allows for a certain, and this is probably a little tense for some people, I would say, a limited pluralism
Hmm.
within the Catholic intellectual tradition, right? I mean, at the end of the day, you can't really be a Platonist and an Aristotelian, I would say, fully, right?
Hmm.
I mean, Plato believes in a world of separate ideas and universals, and Aristotle explicitly disagrees, right? Insofar as they're being separate. Now, maybe Plato and Aristotle are closer to each other than people think. I kind of have that view,
Yeah.
but nevertheless, there's just very important distinctions, right? Certainly saying their political doctrines, right, are quite distinct. So that if both of those have been used legitimately by approved members of the Catholic Church, right?
Yeah.
Then it does mean that there's going to be strains, and there's going to be part of the Catholic intellectual tradition that doesn't agree with this part of the Catholic intellectual tradition on some things and not others. Now, God willing, of course, we all agree on Christological dogmas and Trinitarian dogmas and things of that nature, right? But that there are going to be points of epistemology, metaphysics, maybe even some ethical issues where we differ. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that's right. I mean, there are unresolved questions in the Catholic intellectual tradition.
Right.
Right. That deal with some pretty big things, right? So one of the things that comes up over and over and over again, one can never avoid it no matter how hard he tries, is the issue of future contingency and divine causality and all that, right?
Right. Providence, predestination.
Yeah, like how you work all that stuff out is going to have a lot to do with certain metaphysical presuppositions, right? And that's one of those places in which you see where those unresolved questions are.
Right. Yeah.
But the church affirms the liberty of the schools on these points.
Right. And that's a thing I think about the Catholic intellectual tradition, Catholic faith in general, that people maybe sometimes underappreciate. Right.
Yeah.
I was just talking to somebody recently who's interested in coming to the Catholic Church, and we had a great conversation. He's a great dude, really enjoyed talking to him. But he's kind of definitely like intellectual guy, and he's wanting to convert, right? And it sort of has that. Sometimes there's what sometimes people will call like being a cage stage Calvinist, right? Where you're like a hardcore Calvinist, you want to just bash everybody who's not a Calvinist. The truth is, there's also like a cage stage Catholic, right? Yeah. And it's sort of like, if you're not Catholic, you're just stupid, right? And like that's not true. I mean, obviously there are people who are not Catholic who are not stupid, right? you know what I'm saying? You know what I mean? Like, or the alternatives are just all idiotic and blah blah blah, and just whatever. And you want to avoid that too, right? But I think there's a hope, a wish, an understandable wish to some degree by some people for a kind of uniformity, right? Within the Catholic intellectual tradition that doesn't actually exist.
Well,
and that's actually a good thing. Now I want to caution immediately, don't anybody freak out. Okay. I said, I don't think there's a uniformity about I should say about everything, right? There's certainly a unity and there's a consistency on matters that are core, right? And those core things, are settled by the church over time. But that there's still, with that unity in mind and within certain parameters, maybe there's another way of putting it, there is a legitimate diversity of views.
Right. So, I tend to make a distinction as follows. Now, I'm using these words in the way I'm defining them here, but this is the way I kind of conceptualize it. There's a dogma, there's doctrine, and there's theological opinion or judgment, right? So, if you say, what are the dogmatic questions? Well, those are the questions that cut to the very heart of revelation itself, right? What is being revealed by God about himself, about his relationship or our relationship to him, his intentions for creation, etc. What's actually in the data God reveals, right? That's the dogmatic question. Um, the doctrinal question is, the way the church teaches on the basis of that, right? And so you could have doctrine, maybe we would admit of even different categories of doctrine. We might
Sure.
say common doctrine, we might say established church teaching, that sort of thing.
Mhm.
Or we might say doctrines in the sense of um, schools of thought, right? That
Sure.
certainly have their place, right? But alongside other schools of thought,
Right.
which also consistently develop teachings on the basis of what's revealed. And then finally, theological opinion or judgment would be where the distinct theologian confronts a question which is in fact open
Mhm.
and formulates an opinion on the basis of what's taught and what's revealed,
Sure. Sure.
right? And in that realm in particular, there's actually a great deal of liberty,
Mhm.
provided
Yeah.
what it is, the judgment that you're forming, the theological opinion you're articulating, is responsible to those other things.
Yes. Yes. I think that's the way of putting it. It's a good way of putting it. Um, kind of like what we were talking about before about sort of being responsible to the New Testament data, right?
Right,
That kind of thing, right? You can't just make up anything,
right,
right?
right.
Like it's got to actually fit the narratives, right,
Yeah.
of Scripture, right? Like for example, that Jesus was a dude, right?
Mhm.
Right? You can't just sort of ignore that. I think that's a great point, Rich. And then so in all this, there's sort of a balance, right? It seems to me that you're trying to strike. And there's one other element I want to bring in here of balance. Kind of know we're kind of drawing here a little bit towards our end, but is so we've talked about being engaged, right, in
Mhm.
the present and being engaged with certain questions, being part of a specific community and drawing on historical sources, right, as all part of the Catholic intellectual tradition. Another part of it, though, I think, is as we're engaging in the present, discerning how much of the past is brought into the present and the future, right?
Yes.
Right. And how much new can we take on, right? Would be
Mhm.
another way of putting that, right? That maybe is anticipated by certain things maybe in the tradition, but certainly isn't maybe a strong element or hasn't
Mhm.
been visible or very manifest or something like that, right? So, to borrow a little bit from John Henry Newman, like the acorn doesn't necessarily look very much like the developed oak tree in its full mature glory, right?
Mhm.
In fact, they look remarkably different,
Yeah.
actually, right? That's something to think about, right? If you think about, if you accept kind of a organic development kind of point of
Mhm.
view, right? Now, that's in a dogmatic context where that's employed most of the time, but I think more broadly in the Catholic intellectual tradition, right? So, I'm on sort of so let me make this kind of concrete and we can maybe tease this out a little bit, but say, this is a can of worms, but I'm gonna bring it up anyways. The 20th century sort of theological debate within the church, right? Between ressourcement and we'll say very rigorous Thomist, right?
Yeah.
There's a definite 20th century clash there, right? And sometimes you can think of that clash. I mean, there are probably aspect, leaving aside maybe ethical or moral negative things about it. It's necessary, it seems to me, that there are going to be clashes in the Catholic intellectual tradition. We've talked about, right? There's going to be disputation. There's going to be a legitimate pluralism,
Yeah.
right? And if there are, then there's going to be disagreements, and those disagreements are going to lead to disputes, and that's and it's to a certain degree fine, right?
Mhm.
Again, always up to a point and within certain parameters. Um, and obviously, my sympathies are more on the Thomist side, but you do have to say this, even from that perspective. Um, Very importantly, there's nothing wrong with, in principle, right? And there's a very clear, good reason for this to say this, but in principle, for new or sort of emergent Catholic theological movements apprising themselves of maybe different philosophical resources than are used by Thomists, right? Obviously, a historically self-conscious Thomist couldn't hold that position without historical contradiction, right?
Right.
Right. I mean, vis-a-vis Thomas appropriating Albert the Great and Thomas appropriating Aristotle, who we talked about earlier, was new, right?
Yeah. And intensely controversial.
And intensely controversial, right? So, I'm quite happy to accept whatever insights phenomenology has to offer. I'm also happy to offer my friendly criticisms. But there's nothing in principle wrong, right?
Mm-hmm.
With new theological movements taking up new philosophical presuppositions or methodologies or things of that nature, right? Which does then, there's going to be that does mean there's going to be some tension and some disputation. I think that's okay up to a point. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. So you need to be tethered to those, immutable things, right? To those points that we can't diverge from without undermining our proclamation of faith.
Right.
Right. The dogma, you've got to be firm on that.
Yeah.
But I think, it's sort of like iron sharpening iron, right? In the sense that, that dialogue is a way of ferreting out the weaknesses in, the new position. So as you and I are sort of, this is a point of, I don't want to quite say tension. That's not the right word, but this is a point at which you and I are sort of on different sides of that fence, I guess, right? I tend to be more of a ressourcement aggiornamento type, more sympathetic to the personalist, phenomenological approach, although I'm firmly grounded in the Thomistic tradition as well, right? I mean, I was formed in that before I took up this other stuff. So the discussion that takes place, the debate, the disagreements, right? It forces people not to embrace with too much enthusiasm a view that's not as strong or defensible as it really needs to be in the long run.
Right.
And so it forces it to be developed further. That's an important stage, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And on the other side, right, let's say that the other side prevails in the long run, the more conservative view, it too is being tested.
Sure.
There are questions being put to it that perhaps from within its own history haven't yet been confronted.
Right.
And it needs to confront those things, right? So it's a process, as you say. Let's not use the word necessary. Maybe it's well, I guess it is necessary. We might use the word unavoidable or inevitable, right? I mean, it's as new questions arise, there is a philosophical tradition going on out there, even if we're not a part of it. And it's forcing certain questions. So eventually they're going to show up at our door. And how will we deal with them?
That's right. Yeah. I agree. So I think, when you're thinking then about the Catholic intellectual tradition, you're going to expect, I think, to see new, right? And I think as a Catholic intellectual, so you're a Catholic intellectual, you want to be part of this ongoing tradition, right? You both want to look at the new in a way that is, like we talked about earlier, engaged, that tries to understand it as a whole, right? Is critical, in a just way, right? Not an unjust way. But isn't, and I think a lot of Catholics struggle with this. I struggle with it. I think the church is struggling with it. but isn't closed off to what's new necessarily, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, that doesn't mean open to everything new either.
Right.
Right. And so that's where there's a tension, right? I think in the Catholic intellectual tradition, a kind of healthy tradition, a healthy challenge, right? Of discerning the new and discerning, as I say, how much of the past we preserve in the present,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, for example, I have friends who are and fellow travelers, I would say, up to a point, Catholic monarchists.
Mm-hmm.
And with all due respect to that tradition, like I'm no anti-monarchist, right? Like I don't sit around thinking, man, I really hate kings. Like
Mm-hmm.
that's pretty far from my mind, right? But at the same time, I kind of think it just doesn't seem like a really lively option right
Uh-huh.
now.
Mm-hmm.
Like I don't know that's not the forefront of my political thought and engagement, because it just doesn't seem like a live option. Do you know
Yeah.
what I mean?
It's
And
not
so
fit for the time, perhaps, right?
sure, yeah. I'm a philosopher, so I'm happy to just deal with abstractions too. And we can have abstract arguments about monarchy, and that's lovely and a good thing to do. And we even had a podcast about Christian
Right.
monarchy, right? But at the same time, sort of like advocating for it strongly, like that just doesn't seem to me like something that I need to spend a lot of my intellectual energy on. There might be other things that are more, sort of theological, right? That we have to think through. Obviously, a big touchy issue for us in all of this is the reform of the liturgy, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a huge issue, right? Still a matter of great dispute and angst amongst people, and for some understandable reasons, right? How much of the old liturgy should be preserved? How much should new things be brought in or reintroduced, right? Those are I was fraught questions, and I don't expect you, Rich, to answer that right now. But that's I think a very good example of this discernment of the new that I'm
Yeah.
trying
Uh-huh.
to bring out. That's part of the Catholic intellectual tradition.
Yeah. So it's there are a couple more points in our discussion that that come to my mind, right? And I think, Francis talks a lot about, he uses this word accompaniment,
Mm-hmm.
and we've been hearing the word dialogue for a long, long time.
Mm-hmm.
Now, many people, of course, they're critical of Francis' use of the word accompaniment because it doesn't appear to be really clearly defined anywhere.
Mm.
But I think that let me give it a shot, right?
Okay.
Okay, so accompaniment maybe means, I mean, I'll give it a definition that, theologically makes sense to me, right?
Okay.
Accompaniment would mean engaging people where they are, knowing where the horizon of truth lies. We know where the horizon of truth lies. But it's sort of like a cave rescue. Well, yeah, to use the allegory of the cave as an image,
Sure.
right?
Okay. Good. Yeah.
You go down into that cave, and the
Right.
guy doesn't know anything about what's up on the surface, right? He can't even begin to imagine it.
Right. Right. Uh-huh.
And so you've got to sort of coax him out of his situation,
Sure.
and lead him, through these in toddling steps, and
Right.
on the basis of what he's able to think and imagine, you lead him closer and closer. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
that's what accompaniment means. And that would be true not only at the level of intellect, but at the level of morals as
Sure.
well, right? That there are
Mhm.
certain moral positions this person can't yet imagine as
Mhm.
being possible.
Sure. Sure.
And that not only are they possible, but necessary.
Right.
And so you have to kind of recognize the fact that he's incapable of it at the moment.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so I think that's what Francis is
Yeah. Yeah.
trying to say.
Sure. Yeah.
Right now, there are precise and imprecise ways of articulating that,
Mhm.
and I think the criticisms are well founded. That some rather imprecise ways have been used to
Sure.
try to identify that problem, but I think that's what he means.
Gotcha.
Okay,
Yeah.
so
Mhm.
and that makes sense to me. So going back to this issue of engaging people who are wrong, and I know they're wrong, right? It's a fact of human psychology, right? That we are in fact more receptive to the other guy's view if we start from the position that we believe we've been given a fair hearing.
Yes, sure.
Right? Like, that's so if I am going to debate with and try to refute this other guy's position, if in the end I'm going to have to tell him that he is wrong,
right,
it's really important for me
mm-hmm.
to understand his point of view,
yes.
to be able to see from within that framework.
Yes,
like that's how I will accompany him
to
the truth.
Yep. I think that's completely correct. Yeah, I think that's a good and that's a good example too, Rich, of a term, an idea, a concept, right? that is newish anyways, right? Being sort of incorporated into the Catholic intellectual tradition, right? I think that's good. So and is maybe a feature, right, of actually doing it the right way, right? In the sense that you're engaging with and maybe even critical, but in a way that maybe takes place within the context of friendship, right?
Yeah.
And a just hearing out, that sort of thing. I think that's maybe a good way of putting it. Yeah, and a good part of the tradition. Did you have anything else you wanted to add there, Rich?
Yeah, I wanted to just return to this, the disputed question idea, and the fact that you and I have both challenged students to engage in that exercise, right, as professors. And I've noticed that, with me, I've had varying degrees of success with it. But I've noticed that today, specifically with young Gen Zers, it's becoming increasingly difficult to do, in my experience. And there are basically two reasons that are at work here.
Okay.
We could probably do a whole podcast just on this topic.
Sure.
But I wanted to hear your response to what it is I'm about to say. The first problem is that people don't really have the concept of logical argumentation anymore. Like the idea of articulating premises that relate to each other in such a way that they necessarily yield a conclusion, is like people just don't get that idea. They'll use a proposition as an argument.
Yeah. My argument is blah.
One proposition doesn't cut it.
Yeah.
And then the other reason it's very difficult to engage in this, and this may be more fundamental, is that they really do have a very, very difficult time crediting their intellectual opponent with the integrity of his own position.
Right.
They can't understand the idea of arguing for a position that you do not hold.
Yeah. So this latter point, do you think more, I've thought about this a bit, a moral failing or a lack of intellectual imagination?
Yeah, I'm not, I've been thinking
the inability
I'm not sure you can separate those two.
Yeah. Because the inability to see the possible rationality of the other's position. Now, I'll say this: when I just finished teaching critical thinking this last semester, I think one definite thing is if you're in charge of curriculum anywhere in something, please add logic and critical thinking or something like it, please. Right? There's probably a few courses that we could be more important, to be honest, right? But when I teach it explicitly, one of the things I add in is I start with the idea of fallibility and personal fallibility. And I ask everybody in the room, have you ever been wrong?
Yeah.
everybody raises their hand. I mean, unless you're a complete like wacko, right? Like it's unless you're psychotic, right? You're going to raise your hand. Yeah, I've been wrong. Yeah.
Uh,
Like just once or more than once, so I kind of go through this
yeah,
little routine,
probably a
right?
lot. Mm-hmm.
And I say, so you're fallible. And that, yeah, you can make mistakes. We can make errors. We're human, right? If you can kind of tease that out a little bit, I think people will embrace the idea that their opponent, from that you infer, so your opponent could be right.
Yeah,
Right?
I could be wrong in this instance.
That's right.
Right.
And your opponent right. I think but you have to, I think, kind of like to really kind of bring it out, right, in a way that focuses on that issue. If you jump into it, like, say, let's argue about abortion, gay marriage, transgenderism, something like that, the a priori principles and sentiments will kick in too hard, right?
Yeah.
You can't use one of those examples and try to bring this point out. You
Mm-hmm.
have to focus on just the idea of fallibilism is what I would say.
Yeah, yeah.
Work out from there. So I do have some hope, that can happen. I've seen it happen. Now, getting you to move from I intellectually accept in general that I'm fallible, I could be wrong, and my opponent is right. Could be right. Transferring that to a particular issue, right? That'll be I mean, I can only hope, I'd give the students what I can in class to help them do that.
Yeah. So I
But
guess
it does seem to me that there's an interconnection between both there being a moral failure and a lack of intellectual imagination there.
yeah. So I guess my sort of, closing thoughts today would be that I think all the things we've said today are pretty much right about how we should think about the Catholic intellectual tradition, about how broadly we should conceptualize it, the way we need to engage, all the issues that come to bear upon the world in which we're trying to live out our covenant with God and profession of faith.
That's right.
At the same time, I think that in this moment where we're doing that very thing, we need to come to grips with the fact that we are facing certain intellectual crises within our own believing community, and or at least that permeate our community, and that we need to recover certain qualities that we once possessed as a Catholic intellectual community. The capacity actually to listen to the other side, to engage it on its own terms, rather than just to close off against it and be insular, while at the same time, right, the equally important capacity to identify what's central to our own position, and not to be so uncritically open that we adopt views for ourselves that are antithetical to our core beliefs.
Yeah. I think that's key. Yeah, you're right. I mean, it's easier to be one without keeping the other in mind, right?
Yeah, but that's how heresy works.
That's how I think how we tend to decline, right, as thinkers, right? When we sort of, I'm going to latch on to the fixity and just sort of reject anything new, or I'm going to just latch on to the new and not let anything that's fixed help me discern that some of the new might be bad, right? Or contrary to the deep sources, right, of the faith. I think maybe a somewhat similar way of putting what you put there, Rich, and say this carefully, is and maybe just as kind of food for further thought, is that I think in the Catholic intellectual tradition, content and process are probably equally important, because change is part of the Catholic intellectual tradition as a historical reality, right? we've talked a good bit about the process stuff, being engaged, the present, thinking about, the new and the past, being engaged in the past, those sorts of things, being a member of the community, right?
Mhm.
But that always has to be balanced with the fixed dogmatic content, right, of the faith,
Yeah.
as well as the fixed, I would say, sources of the faith and sources of the Catholic intellectual tradition, right? That I think are canonical, and the permanent questions, right? We're always going to come back to the question of Christ, the question of the Trinity, the question of grace. Those are going to be things that we have to revisit. Does that sound good, Rich?
Yeah, it does.
Good.
Right. So, great discussion.
Yeah, it was fun.
I think there are a lot of other podcasts we could probably have spinning off of this discussion.
Sure.
But for the listeners, I hope you got something out of this, and hopefully it made you a more careful and appreciative thinker. So thanks, Dr. Smith. And till next time, God bless.